Hi everyone, in this video we're going to be taking a look at how to write a narrative. Now specifically this video has been designed for anyone studying level 1 or level 2 functional skills English. This is a really important question that comes up quite often these days on the writing assessment, so let's have a look at it now and go through it together. If you haven't done so already, please could you like and subscribe, it really does help us out when you do so. So what is meant by the term narrative? This is a relatively new question that I've actually come across for the functional skills course, so it's really important to actually understand what specifically is it they're going to ask us to focus on. So a narrative is a story or a personal account of something that's happened. Questions on this will focus on things such as an eyewitness account of something. So for example, I've seen some practice papers specifically for City and Guilds which focus on retelling an event like a minor crash where you have to recount your story in terms of a police statement or something like that. A day in the life, so writing a diary, writing something about your own kind of personal experiences. And finally, an account of a holiday. These are the typical kind of things that have come up in the past few years. So important thing to note before we move on is the teacher's top tip. So make sure you're aware of the different forms of writing. Remember that a review of a holiday and an account of a holiday will be very different. So when we're talking about the forms of writing, something that causes a lot of anxiety for people when they're actually doing the writing assessment is sometimes they won't be too sure how to lay out a leaflet, a speech, an article, and all of these are going to be ever so slightly different. So if you're not too sure, please do check out our other videos that go into this in more detail. By the end of the lesson, you'll be able to understand the presentational or organisational features of a narrative piece of writing, analyse a model response, and finally, apply your understanding to write a response to an exam style question. So this is all gearing us up to actually do a bit of practice for the writing assessment, both for level 1 and for level 2. Look at the organisational or presentational features below and decide which ones belong to narrative writing. So many of these features are ones that you should have come across before when you're doing the other kind of forms of writing. So just have a quick think now, out of the ones that are provided there, which ones of these belong to narrative writing and which ones would you use potentially for a different form of writing. So try and stretch and challenge yourself and recall the features used by some of the other forms that we've looked at in our previous lessons. If you want to pause the video here, please feel free to do so. We're now going to jump ahead and look at the answers in the next part of the video. Class feedback. Check your understanding against the teachers. So on the left hand side then we have the different form of writing, and on the right we have the organisational or presentational features that they typically use. So the first one, the one that we're focusing on largely in today's video, is narrative writing. So for that, it's fairly straightforward. All you really need to include is making sure that you've got a title and that you're writing in paragraphs. So fairly straightforward for that one. For a review, you do a title, paragraphs, subheadings, and a star rating. So if you think back to the previous comment that I made about the fact that you might get a narrative question asking you to write about a holiday, and then you might also get a review asking you about a holiday. Even though these two sound quite similar, the way that you present them or organise the information is going to be very different. Thirdly, we have a letter, and you need a sender's or recipient's address, and of course you need to write in paragraphs as with any form of writing as well. Instructional writing, now this was one that we recently went over. It's generally quite straightforward, but it's really important that you're aware of the features that you need. So for instructional writing, we have title, paragraphs, bullet points, and subheadings. And you can see there, as I've added in the brackets, subheadings is actually optional. If you are doing instructional writing, it will be something like giving instructions to someone who is house sitting for you, and then you might use those subheadings to break down the different kind of duties that you'd like them to carry out. Next we have an article. Very simple, it's a headline and paragraphs. Now a headline is different from a title. They kind of look the same, however a headline is supposed to actually hook you in. If you look at any typical headline that you get for a newspaper, they'll often use things like a pun or a play on words to grab your interest and to get you actually engaged with what they're writing about. And then finally we have a report. This is one that a lot of people struggle with, so if you're not too sure, please do check out our other videos. We've got quite a few that go into it in more detail. So we have a title, paragraphs, subheadings, and potentially bullet points as well. Look at the exam question and attempt the challenges that follow. So again, we're thinking back to the idea of narrative writing. This is a very typical question that you might face in the exam. You've been asked to write a narrative account of your first day at college. In your response, you should write in chronological order. Now, if you're not sure what we mean by that, chronological order means the order in which things naturally occurred. So what did you do first, second, thirdly, and so on and so forth. Structure your response appropriately. Now, when you talk about language as English as a subject, you have two different categories really. You have language and you have structure. And structure really comes down to things like, are you varying your sentence lengths? Are you writing in paragraphs? Have you actually broken it down in a manageable way for the reader? Write in a clear and concise manner. Are you actually making sense? Are you writing in the correct tense? Maybe if you're someone who is English as a second language, this can sometimes be a bit tricky, so it's important to kind of read it aloud sometimes and make sure, does it actually sound the way you intended it to sound when you put it down on paper? Check your spelling, punctuation and grammar. Now, it doesn't matter which kind of writing task you get, this is going to be a very fundamental thing to do across all kind of writing tasks as well. Use a range of appropriate language devices. Now, hopefully you've went through some of these before. The acronym we tend to use is DeForest. Again, if you're not too sure about that one, do check out our other videos that go through those in more detail. And aim to write between 200 to 250 words. This is a very typical kind of word count that you would expect for level 1 and for level 2 as well. Obviously you get 2 tasks within your actual exam, so it's important to think about how long does it take you to produce this amount of writing. So now that we've looked at the question, let's think about a few challenges to help us actually focus on what we need to focus on. So the first thing to think about is what presentational or organisational features would you need for this response? Again, if you're not too sure, check out the previous part of the video where we went through that in more detail. Super challenge. Come up with 3 or more ideas to plan your response. Now, it doesn't really matter what form of writing you're asked to produce. Generally speaking, 3 strong ideas would be a really good thing to help actually structure any form of writing that you have to produce in English. And then the mega challenge. What language devices would be most effective for this kind of assessment question? So we mentioned earlier that we've been through things like DeForest techniques. Now you don't need to use every single one of those techniques for level 1 and for level 2, but try and think which ones would be the most appropriate or the most effective for the kind of task we've been asked to write. Class feedback. Check your understanding against the answers below. So challenge. For narrative writing, we need to use a title and paragraphs. And that's it really in terms of the organisational features. Super challenge. 3 main ideas may include your first impressions of the college, the facilities that are available, and how you felt as you took the first step on your course. What we mean by that is, how do you feel like after maybe not being in education for a while and then you're setting out on a new path, a new trajectory? Does that something that makes you feel excited, nervous or scared? There might be a lot of emotions, a lot of potential things to talk about in that response. And then finally, for the mega challenge, some key techniques may be things like emotive language. Again, first day, doing anything, there'd be a lot of emotions involved, I'd imagine. Opinions, so how do you feel? How did you actually feel as you went through certain experiences through the day, things like that. Using discourse markers. If you're not too sure what I mean by this is things like firstly, secondly, thirdly, and finally. These are called sequencing discourse markers, and they're really good to help structure your response. You can also use words like however and on the other hand to present a more balanced argument. A lot of the time when we are experiencing things, it's not always totally good or not always totally bad. Sometimes there's a mixture of both, so feel free to use some of those language devices as well, just to make your writing that much more engaging. Look at the model example and attempt the challenges that follow. My first day at college. All I can remember about my first day at college was one word: fear. I am so scared on my first day that I don't know how on earth that I got through that day. Firstly, I remember the building looking like some intimidating giant structure that did nothing to calm my nerves. To make matters worse, I had to go through a metal detector before I could even go into the entrance. Secondly, I had no idea where I was going. I felt scared, worried and alone. Luckily, this feeling didn't last the whole day. So this is just a typical response that I've got a learner to actually produce a few years ago, describing a different college. And what we want to think about now is, has the response used the correct organisational features? So does it look the way you'd expect a piece of narrative writing to look? Has it used the kind of things that make it stand out as a piece of narrative writing? Super challenge. Identify anything that works well or anything that may need to be improved. With a lot of things in English, it's not about getting perfection, it's about making progress. It's about identifying where the mistakes are and addressing them when we make our own response. And the mega challenge. Do you think this is a successful response? And try and actually justify your answer. If yes, provide some actual evidence, a quotation. What specifically about this makes it effective? Or, if you think it can be improved, how so? What is preventing this response from getting the highest mark possible? Class feedback. Check your understanding against the examiner's feedback. So now what we've done is we've taken the same response and we've actually marked it the same way that you would if this was an actual exam. So on the left hand side then we have the same response that we just went through, and on the right we're going to actually have the feedback given by an examiner. The first thing we're going to focus on is what went well. So these are going to be the positive things, the things that are going to get the student a few marks in the actual assessment. So firstly then, the response has used the organisational features for narrative writing. So if we look at that a bit closer, it has used a title and it has used paragraphs very clearly. Written in a clear and concise way, mostly. Now, this is actually good feedback, but we should be a little bit worried by that phrase, mostly. Now, what this actually implies is that although the response has done some good things, there may be some errors, there may be some areas where it doesn't quite make complete sense. So that's going to be something that we look at for the even better if, so the ways that this might be improved. Some language techniques have been used. Okay, that's fantastic. We don't need to use all of the DeForest techniques, so knowing that some of them have been used is certainly showing that we're on the right track. Some, however, is a word that also implies that we don't have loads of them, so maybe there's some area for improvement there as well. EBI, even better if. So the first thing the examiner said is avoid changing the tense in this response. Now, the only way that we can understand this is really thinking about, is it consistent? So are you either talking about something that's happened in the past, or something that's happened in the present, or even something that will happen in the future? And the only error really we have there is, I am so scared on my first day. Now, clearly from the start of this, it's going to actually be in the past tense, because it's talking about remembering the first day. But now it's gone to future present tense. I am so scared. Well, you can't be scared now because it's something that's happened in the past, okay? So you'd have to change that up a little bit. Saying something like I was so scared would actually help and change the tense a bit more. A range of language techniques are needed, and you can see there in brackets we have level 2. So this is more for people who are thinking about going on to level 2 or even GCSE English. Yes, this made quite a good start really. It has used a few techniques, but in order to get a really high mark, especially when you think about level 2 or GCSE, we would be after a few more examples of language techniques. A range of punctuation would gain more marks, and the response doesn't meet the desired word count. Now, I'm not expecting you to go through it and actually think about counting every single word, but do the sight test, have a look at it, see if it roughly meets the kind of word count you'd expect for 200 to 300 kind of words. That's kind of where we really need to be aiming. Now, if we start actually analysing this a bit more, let's start thinking about some of the mistakes, some of the things that could be improved, and also some things that work well. So I'll read through it again and we'll start making some annotations. So it says that all I can remember about my first day at college was one word, fear. Oh, I am so scared that on my first day, I don't know how on earth I got through that day. Well, we know because of the tense that it doesn't quite make sense. We also have an issue with homophones. If you're not too sure what I mean by that, a homophone is something that sounds the same but it's spelled differently. So this is actually the wrong through. So that will be the first thing to think about. Now if we look at the second paragraph, we can see it's used a really good sequence and discourse marker with firstly. So we know very clearly it's going to talk about the first thing they experienced. Firstly, I remember the building looking like some intimidating, giant structure that did nothing to calm my nerves. We have some wonderful adjectives here. Intimidating, giant, really is conveying this idea that the person isn't looking forward to going to this college. And then you also have nerves, so we know that they're talking about emotive language. Next, however, we do have another mistake. Again, it's another homophone, so maybe this is an area that the learner needs to go through in more detail. So this is the wrong two. There's actually 3 different types of two, so it's important that you go through and make sure you know the different types as well. To make matters worse, I had to go through a metal detector before I could even get into the entrance. Okay, nothing wrong with that. This isn't actually a real college. The learners actually kind of elaborated a bit, kind of made it up, and there's nothing wrong with that. You can use your imagination, and generally speaking, something about British culture, we tend to lean more towards being more negative rather than positive. So be a bit creative with it. Make out it's maybe worse than it really is, potentially. Secondly, again, we've got another really good sequence and discourse marker. I had no idea where I was going. I felt scared, worried, and alone. So not only do we have emotive language here, scared, worried, and alone, but this is also a triplet or a group of 3, so 3 ideas towards a common goal. Luckily, this feeling didn't last the whole day. Now, I think this is a really good thing to end the paragraph on, because it's actually making me think from a structural point of view. Well, clearly their day improved. Clearly they maybe had a bad impression of the college at first, but then as the day went on, maybe it got more positive. So structurally that actually works well, because it's making me want to read on and find out more about this person's experience. Again, this piece of writing is actually fictional. It's not based on a real college. So think about how you could maybe build on this, add some of your own ideas maybe when you come to write your own response. So now what we're going to do is we're going to look back at the exam question and just think about these following challenges. So first of all then, here was our question. So you've been asked to write a narrative account of your first day at college. In your response you should write in chronological order, so again the order in which things occurred. Structure response appropriately, so use paragraphs, use sequence and discourse markers. Write in a clear and concise manner. Check your spelling, punctuation and grammar. As we could see there was many issues there with the homophones, so that is going to be something that, because there's quite a few errors, it's going to actually impact negatively on the final mark. Use a range of appropriate language devices and aim to write between 200 to 350 words. Now earlier on in the video I actually did say 200 to 300, and the reason why I actually said that is because you won't really get penalised if you go a little bit over. They're not expecting you to count every single word. It's about an approximation of how much you should write as well. It's really important to keep in your mind as well that at the same time you might be spending a long time on this question. In an exam you'll actually have 2 of these to respond to as well, so don't dedicate all of your time to this. Make sure that you're actually managing your time effectively, spending enough time trying to hit the word count if you can, but also making sure you've got enough time so you can get onto that next question. So once we've looked at that question, then things I'd like to think about is what makes a good response. Try and come up with 3 or more top tips for your own response. Okay, so what kind of advice would you give to yourself or someone else who's about to have a go at some narrative writing? Super challenge. Use everything we have covered so far to plan and write your own response. And then mega challenge. You can email this to me if you need to, or hand in your response for some feedback. Without feedback, you're limiting yourself because you're not actually knowing what you've done well and what you need to improve. So that's a really important step when you are doing your writing. Have you got feedback? Are you actually responding to it in an appropriate manner? If you need any additional support or help, the new videos will be added every single week. Alternatively, you can leave us a comment below or visit our partner channel, Bookworm Teaching, for more lessons and guidance on all things English. Thanks ever so much for listening guys, and all the best with your work and revision in the future. Bye bye.